Universities have historically held and acquired collections of First Nations cultures in various iterations, such as art, archives and cultural material. Increasingly, these collections have been employed for reconnection and reconciliation, uncovering old perspectives and creating new narratives that utilise interdisciplinary approaches with First Nations perspectives to amplify the voices of the makers. The Voicing the Living Archive, working with First Nations collections in higher education symposium, was held at the University of Canberra on July the 18th and 19th, 2024. It highlighted some recent projects that focus and examine First Nations collections across different areas of universities, from research to teaching. The event was organised by Dr. Wendy Somerville, Hakim Rahim Abdul and Katie Hain of the University of Canberra, and supported by the International Council of Museums Committee for University Museums and Collections and the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research at the University of Canberra.
Professor Sandy O'Sullivan is a transgender Wiradjuri person. They lead the intimacies theme of the Centre for Global Indigenous Futures, and they work in the Department of Critical Indigenous Studies, both housed at Macquarie University. They are a 2020 to 2025 ARC Senior Futures Fellow with the program titled Saving Lives and Mapping the Influence of Indigenous LGBTQ+ Creative Artists. This nationally funded work follows on from another major ARC project that explored representation and engagement from Indigenous peoples and communities across national museums, a program that ran for 8 years and reviewed 470 museums. Wow. Since 1991, they've taught and researched across gender and sexuality, education, museums, the body, creativities, and First Nations identities. Sandy has been a musician, performer, and sound artist since 1982, holding national and international residencies. So please welcome Sandy to give the talk.
First of all, what an amazing introduction and welcome. Welcome, first of all. I think there's nothing like being welcomed onto country and knowing that it's genuine and knowing that it's connected. Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, look, this area, this place, it's so close to my place, Wiradjuri community, and it's connected up, and of course we're all connected up, it's how it works, and it's a remarkable moment to be down here. I live in Kabi land and up in Queensland, and work at Macquarie in New South Wales on Darug. I did visit 470 museums, not just write about them and not just review them. Visiting them was remarkable, it really was, and it was across three formed meta-nations of a whole lot of Indigenous nations. One of them wasn't Indigenous nations. I can't go into it here, but feel free to read some of the stuff that I've talked about, and that's the UK. The other was Turtle Island, but mostly the US, and then here. I don't talk about decolonial in the context of universities or museums. I don't think it's possible to do decolonial work in colonial institutions. They are desperately colonial, and the only work that you can do is anti-colonial work, and everybody can do that, but it should be centred from us. I'm really worried about the whole seeking permission from universities for anything to do with collections. They're not the ones that should be giving permission, but certainly there are these mechanisms that need to be understood within the university system. And look, what I want to do today is to spend a little bit of time talking about that, but mostly take you through a few different spaces that I have my research colleague, Dr. Hanridden Smith here, and actually we're doing an in-conversation about some of the work broadly that we've been doing outside and within the museum space early evening this evening. But we do this work across the public imaginaries. We got funded for work that wasn't necessarily museums, but of course it was going to be, because this is the work that where we find a lot of our art and we find a lot of our culture in that same way as lost. So all of the problems with these terms, all of the difficulties with the ways that they've been deployed. And we locate material and our very bodies that have been stolen and have somehow found their way into these collections and often then not made visible. And of course, this is the problem that we have with the way that collections are managed. It's filled with ideas that maybe, as Wendy was saying, that the material gets lost. Some of the information around it is lost over time. It's lost because people didn't care about it. It's lost because it wasn't seen to have value to think about where it came from. To go to somewhere like Peabody at Harvard that still has a whole lot of material listed as Eastern Australia, whatever that is. So this is, the anti-colonial work has to be taking on the colonial and it has to start within institutions. But I wonder why we have collections in the first place. And of course we all wonder that. But also I genuinely mean it. I don't mean we shouldn't have them. It's not a declarative in the form of a question. It's a real question. Is it for teaching? Is it for research? Or is that just what we tell people it is? So is that just the narrative that we have to have? Because otherwise the collections that were managed into universities, either historically or for more recent universities, because they knew that these other universities had them. And so this just becomes its own iterative problem where it then gets worked into, isn't fit for purpose, is fit for purpose, curriculum gets managed into whatever is available, and speaking really broadly about collections here, not just our collections. But also, what does it mean to return and repatriate? I mean, I know that all of us are thinking about this, and these are just some sort of, preset questions. What it can't be, the collections and any of the process that we have can't just be because we have them. That can't be the answer to it. Managing how collections are, systematised can't be because we have them. It has to be something else. And so the return or repatriation is, if anybody is feeling any level of anxiety about the stuff that I'm saying, sort of good, let's sit in that anxiety. Because it's tricky, hey? I mean, it just is. It's tricky to be thinking about this, what it means to return and no longer have. But also the relationship to communities and those other public imaginaries. So cities that we inhabit, the communities that we're a part of, and the other spaces that show and make meaning, like other galleries, other museums. We're here in a space that has quite a lot of them, actually, as it turns out, but they're not here. So a lot of the pull in the last few years, since the pandemic began, is a push to say, actually, this is a way to get students engaged, have things, have objects, have places that might show. So that's not collections, that's a process of showing, and the differences there are really crucial as well. One of the interesting things that I've experienced, but so many of my colleagues have experienced, not at Macquarie necessarily, though at Macquarie as well, is how many of us work across this space, but the people who are involved with the collections don't engage with us. How many of us have very, very strong skills across this field. I think about someone like distinguished Professor Bronwyn Carlson, who's literally never been approached and has written a book called Monumental Disruptions, which is probably the most important book that's ever been written on tearing down colonial monuments and statues. And there are many of us who do this work, and it's hard sometimes, and I'm talking across the curriculum, I'm not having a go at the people who manage collection, but all of the people who are managing interpretation. And it's really seeing the limits of Indigenous people, and actually that's just an extension of some of the other work that we do. So the work that Hannah and I do is in broadly the public imaginary, but we're specifically looking at queer Indigenous representation. And we're looking at it, in this case, across museums, and it was lacking. So I think there were some very interesting moments that came through, and there's been transformations that have happened across the time that I did that research, or across the 35 years that I've been an academic. But that process is made bigger by the fact that we do work in these spaces. Many of us do not, I didn't go to uni after school. I left school at 13, like lots of people my age, and went back later as a mature age. People have other jobs and other roles and other ways that they've engaged. And this is what we find with a lot of Indigenous academics who are in the academy. You've got people who have got a breadth of knowledge. We've all got more community engagement experience than anyone else, committee experience than anyone else. All of that is to say that it's not an untapped resource, because we're not a resource, but there is engagement that's possible that actually can be a space of learning. And it's a little frustrating that that doesn't happen. So I work at the Department of Critical Indigenous Studies, which has also got the Centre for Global Indigenous Futures. And I'm just going to kick into a few of, I'll just leave that up while I'm actually talking about something slightly different. So one of the interesting things about doing that first project, which was really looking at engagement and representation in the museum space, so it wasn't about collections, but when I turned up to talk to people, they often took me into their stores, and they would ask me questions about who to contact. Fair enough, good. And when I was in Manchester, I was asked about a massive amount of recorded material that had been sent over in 1947 from Yolngu community, so recorded and put onto physical record, onto a vinyl. And it had sat there that whole time until 2011. We have a conversation about it. We don't know what to do with this. It was sent over, but nobody ever did anything with it. Unbelievable. But this is time and time again, this is the process. And it's still the process. It's getting better. But it's getting better because we're there. That's the only reason it's getting better. It's getting better because there is an investment from people who are thinking about this, who are connected back to community. And it doesn't mean that non-Indigenous people can't be engaged in this. We know that people can. We know that there are opportunities for folks to be engaged, but they need to listen and they need to understand the processes. So I've got a few examples to show you. And they're interesting examples. I could be talking about something like the Tlingit polls that were the reciprocal return to Harvard. That was really remarkable. A community turning up there and going, you've got this important work from us that was taken. Why is it here? And then, of course, the Peabody saying, we forgot about that, this thing that we've got displayed. And to their credit, working out, through conversation, a strategy to be able to commission new work and do a swapsy. And it was, community endorsed. I don't know what I think about it, it's not for me to say, but the community wanted that, and it was meaningful. And so I could be talking about that, but I'm going to focus in on some of the queer stuff that we've looked at over the last few years. If anybody after this or later has any questions about any of the other material that you might be thinking about, again, I've got thousands and thousands of images, and I'm really happy to share anything if it's helpful. So this was an interesting exhibition that I went to last year, the Centre for Queer Prairie Studies. You're going to have to excuse my dreadful photography all the way through this. It is reference photos, as I often say. Daniel Heath Justice writes on, actually I might just come to that a little later. I'm just going to explain a little bit about what this was. So effectively there'd never been a queer exhibition, and it was an exhibition that was a bit social history and a bit art. So some of the things that we have to think about in terms of collections here. And the crossover with that is something that we often see in Indigenous-run museums, where we might in other instances see them as really quite separate things. we're often seeing, I use as an example, Banjalaka, I use as an example, almost anywhere, but NMAI, National Museum of the American Indian. It's common to talk about contemporary practice, right? And this is a strategy for being able to talk about that, to be able to have some of that material that is being made rather than simply having material that is part of the everyday experience or a kind of social history. So Centre for Queer and Prairie Studies sounded great, except it's just a temporary exhibition, but it's happening at a moment in time, so this is last year in March, happening at a moment in time when Oklahoma was becoming extremely litigiously anti-trans and anti-queer. So it was a way to, this is the first exhibition that had ever happened, remarkably, and it got a lot of support, including from OSU's Centre for Poets and Writers. So it had engagement, but it was out in the world. OSU hadn't permitted them to have it on campus, but it brought in a lot of the collection that OSU had, and it featured a really important person, Lynn Riggs. Does anyone know, not you, does anyone know who Lynn Riggs is? Anyone? No? Okay, no looking up or anything, I'll tell you. So Lynn Riggs, first of all, you do. So this is Lynn Riggs, who was born in 1899 and died in the mid-1950s. A poet, a writer, Cherokee, gay. Left Oklahoma, but was really, really lauded as an Oklahoman son later. And really escaped, but also had Cherokee landhold. So was able to use, land back, literally, able to use the leased out amount to fund his work as an artist. So it was a kind of remarkable process in the 1920s and 30s. And Riggs wrote, and in fact Daniel Heath Justice has written on Lynn Riggs recently with a new book called The Indigenous Plays, which includes Cherokee Night and Green Grow the Lilacs. And all of his stuff was this pastoral, positive, really interesting work, you know, and just absolutely engaged and engaging, but also very much about the fantasy of Oklahoma at a time when maybe the rest of the country needed it a bit. And so the reason that, of course, and you probably saw, this is the exhibition itself, is that Lynn Riggs and that particular work is the basis for Oklahoma the musical. So it was a gay Cherokee man, in case you didn't know, who wrote the story of Oklahoma. And of course you didn't know because people didn't say it. People didn't say this was an escape, first to Santa Fe, then to New York. People didn't talk about this. But, I mean, it's one thing to be talking about the 50s. This is the University of Oklahoma announcement on Riggs' posthumous honorary degree. He's not gay here either. You know, and the reason I'm mentioning this is, again, how much we trust universities to tell complex stories. How much we trust the material that's held within. This work was actually found, so again, you probably saw that this is a self-portrait, and the work was found in an allied Claremore Museum of History that's connected to the university. It was uncovered along with a whole lot of other notes, and including a couple of unpublished pieces. Riggs was well known in his life, and you know it's a remarkable story, but it's also a story that tells us a little more about where Oklahoma's at the moment, and we saw it with the First Americans Museum, arguably the largest Indigenous museum in the world that has no queer content at all. It's got complexity of identity all the way through it, but does it? Like, we don't know, because that's a measure. Like, I'm going to reel back and say this is a measure of complexity because it's one of the features of some people. And if you're not showing that, you're actually making some choices about how much you're going to have a complete understanding. So what happens if, I don't know, a gender studies course rocks along and says, do you have anything that's there in store? It's no, because nothing was ever written about it, and because that wasn't what was important to whoever was collecting. And this is deeply problematic. And it's not the questions then that are asked. And then I take us to the Gorman. And I thought I'd start with a personal photo, though a public personal. It's part of an exhibition called Picturing Kinship. And that's Veronica Pelasqua and their kid. And it's also Hulea, who you probably know. Many of you will know. They're a kind of, they're a remarkable scholar and artist. So it's Hulea Sinujani. And this is them in their teaching studio. Let me go to, this is us in selfie mode with their students. This is, the thing about the Gorman, and I'll scoot through to photos from the Gorman, is the Gorman is the only art museum at a university in Cross Turtle Island that has the name, holds the name of a native person, Gorman, C.N. Gorman. And that is, it's not the only one that's run by native people, but it is one of few. And to have someone like Hulea, who is absolutely, since the 60s, a remarkable artist and a scholar that just has incredible thoughts. And this is the front of it. So it's at UC Davis, and it's in new premises. This was designed, the front was designed by Hulea. There's a little bit of Louis de Soto. And look, here's the thing. Half of this is university collection. Half of it is borrowed, but their university collection is rich. So there's a lot of work out on loan as well. So there's a very interesting exchange. But it's a direct connection to community. Community are involved in all of this. And the community of artists, as practitioners, are engaged in this. This first exhibition that they started with, naturally, was the West Coast. Was the area that UC Davis is in, covering about 15 different communities, arguably 20. And it has whimsy in it, because that's what you see when you see Indigenous run and led work, is that you see whimsy because of course you do. It's not people trying to be respectful. It's people trying to do as artists and make and collect, more importantly in terms of what we're talking about here, to respond to something that is incredibly important. So this is called suburban Skokkum. And that's a Ventolin, a puffer. This is like a really meaningful kind of engagement. This is blown up. Sadly, I don't think you can quite tell the size of it, but it's probably about 5 times the size of a person, so it's enormous. I'm just going to scoot through to give you a sense of the complexity. We have, again, as you walk in, you see that first piece, but you also see this one, which is, not to give cockroaches a bad name, they've got American flags that they're carrying in and out. And so again, whimsy, it's funny, it's engaging, it gets students thinking. The students are going in there and they're often engaged with this kind of work. This ends up being a bit that's going to remain permanent, which I think is important in terms of the cyclical. But they also have stores that people can go into and engage with. And it's I guess, what might be considered art across the space, but it also engages some of the work that might not be considered art. This is also a commissioned work. So they've started to commission some work, and this is from somebody who is not an artist, was not an artist, who's now an artist, of course, but who had some very deep thoughts about the fact that the bear is there on the Californian flag. Again, it's local, it's meaningful to people who are living there. It's something that's actually engaging. And I think we've got to understand a little bit more about why people are attracted to going into these spaces, why students, why community. I think all of that matters. And if that's not what we're collecting, why? You know, if it's never to be displayed or never shown, absolutely universities should not. If it can't be shown, oh God, universities should not have it. And this is time and again, it's because, you know, we just feel like we've got this, like the capacity and, you know, storage solutions to be able to manage this. I mean, build capacity elsewhere. Longhouse First Nations learning at UBC. I'm making no apologies for selfies, they're really important. They became important during the first part of the research that I was doing on museums as a way of connecting with people, as a way of recalling people, but also as a way of being close to some of the people that I talk to. So Longhouse First Nations House of Learning at UBC, University of British Columbia, did some work that I think is really interesting. They featured at a time when, because of the critical race implications and the way that across Turtle Island, but particularly in the United States, they were responding to that, has limited the distribution of some books. They did some book displays in the mainstream library. And the way that they put the work together drew on their catalogue, on their collection. Books are a part of collections that we have, and we know how fraught they are. Like anybody who's done work in art collections or any other collections across universities know how fraught it is to have deeply problematic stuff in the library. And it happens all the time. The Longhouse First Nations House of Learning at UBC has a really remarkable library. And it's been around for 30 years, 31 years, I think it was 93 from memory. And they have developed up their library to be quite remarkable, but rather than drawing people into it, there was a decision made, and Taya was one of the people to make that decision to put this into the main area. And this is opening up books. Again, this is display. This isn't, here's some books. You know, this has an engaged display, further reading, there is QR codes. It's aimed at different, it's covering off, it's curating different spaces. And it's doing it at a time when this is just incredibly important. So I'm very interested in this piece. So last year, we visited a lot of places. In fact, one of the places that we visited that was really remarkable, that's not here in the photos, but is a children's hospital in Seattle that a colleague of ours is the director of it, and she is a queer Indigenous person and black, and is a remarkable paediatrician. We connected up. This children's hospital has art all the way throughout it, because of course it does. And I think this notion of institutional, we need to understand that the institutional is something that we need to look at, whether it's within a university or whether it's not. And you know, they're doing some of the same things now, and we need to not be precious about, but universities are different. Universities are not different, actually. And when they are, they're different in very strange degrees. And it depends on what the collection is. I mean, they are different in the sense that they were much more violent colonial gatherers than museums. In fact, that's just usually where they ended up. It was mostly the universities themselves and people who worked at universities who were doing that nonsense. So, with some notable exceptions, but certainly across the 20th century. So, I'm also really interested in this work. This work is called Still Here. It's by Gaia, who is a street artist who was commissioned by two different Indigenous community organisations. I was visiting professor at Rhode Island School of Design earlier last year, and had some time with some of the people who are involved with this, and had some time talking about it and hearing about it. I don't have really a commentary on it too much, except to say this is a non-Indigenous person who's done this. They were commissioned by Indigenous people, and an Indigenous person basically said, we want you to do, sorry, not an Indigenous person, Lindsay Imaginaries said, I want you to do a work on me, and I want to have Princess Redwing, who is a really, again, important Narragansett community leader who died in the 1980s. And I want to have, I want to not be wearing whatever you think Native people should wear, and had all of these restrictions on it. It's very large, as you can see. I'm sort of intrigued about the fact that it's got the two museums there, but there's not really any mention of the person who's participating as artist. I'm interested in the way that the story gets told around this. And I'm really, even though it sounds like I'm going, oh, I'm a little bit worried about that, I'm not. I mean, I think this is just something that we have to understand was a solution. Now this, because of its location so central to RISD, becomes part of the teaching practice. It becomes part of the research work. It's considered alongside, and this is true across, I think, anything that involves street work. It's really common for universities to kind of see themselves as going outside of it. One of these galleries has a connection to RISD, and RISD has hosted multiple discussions. Do they own it? Is it owned? Again, this kind of over-interest in who owns what is its own colonial problem, of course. I'm interested because probably the most engaged work that was happening at RISD on their suggestion was happening at Steelyard, which is not RISD, but it's where all of the RISD folks go and do work if they're working across steel in any form, but actually quite a lot of large form art work. And it has a very, very connected, that's Hayley Peters, who is Wampanoag. It has connected engagement with local community. It assumes that local community is centred out. And what the university has done, arguably, or the institute has done, arguably, is use that as a level of authority. And this is often what happens, this distancing to use as levels of authority. I've seen it again and again, and I'm sure some of you have as well. So back to the Centre for Global Indigenous Futures, as I sort of finish up to see if there are any questions, I just wanted to mention Macquarie. So Macquarie, obviously violent coloniser, killed a whole bunch of people, and we've got that name, but also we've got this name, and we've got a collection that's somewhat problematic and good. You know, all of these things are always going to be true, and where there's a lot of good people working towards understanding the collection and understanding the need for it. I wanted to keep that first bit in there so that you can see that I'm on a stick at the time, so that's why it's a bit clunky. This is our department, and as you can see, we have artwork across the department. This is really important work. This is commissioned work and or freely available work, only those two things. But we have a lot of commissioned work that we've done. We've had Charlotte Allingham and Molly Hunt in particular have done a lot of work for the department, and this is incredibly important that we have this up everywhere, that this is what can be seen, that we make political statements through it. This isn't going to get endorsed by the university. We don't care, it's endorsed by us as a department. And it doesn't mean that it's disendorsed by the university either. And this is the point, is that people are teaching into in ways that collections can't be held, because of course they are, you know. And so to look at this and to go through this is to see complexity to tell stories of, there's Tate, of, thanks for that, there's us, and just to show you the kind of context, this is again work that is used across and obviously commissioned. I'm saying commissioned because I think this is a really key thing. That's the university that's commissioned it, you know? And so what does that mean, that the university has commissioned it? What responsibility do we have? What opportunity is there? I use that term very carefully. And they're the kinds of things, you know, if I think about Hilaya Sinajani, or if I think about the work of the Gorman, sort of remarkable work that they're doing in a pretty conservative university. What they're doing is saying, this is an Indigenous place, it's an Indigenous person that runs this, and actually the lead curator who's just come on is also an Indigenous person. We're going to be making sure that the work is meaningful, robust, connected, and the stores tell stories. And when students come along, I can tell you they get asked to do things. So there was a lot of, maybe you can help us plant out the front. There was a lot of, how can you provide service? And these are really important things to be allowing students in terms of that engagement, allowing them the opportunity to be in service. And to maybe even, kindly from Hilaya and Veronica, to have that opportunity to have a discussion as well. But also, you only get things like the Centre for Queer Prairie Studies when certain things happen. Now, there's a guy called Michael O'Keefe who taught graphic design at Oklahoma Christian University, I know, but taught there for more than 40 years, who was fired in 2022 for having a gay guest speak. That was it, you know, and they didn't speak, by the way, so it wasn't whatever they said, because, you know, and so it happens as an act of protest, but it happens off-site as an act of protest in this sort of slightly endorsed, but not completely endorsed way. And this is what we kept seeing time and time again, is, and I know that's like just a jumble of various different instances, but I have 50 more. There are so many instances where you know, they're not engaged. And when it's in spaces where Indigenous collections are held, but there are no Indigenous people there, London, for instance, not no Indigenous people there, but you know what I mean, not to there. There can be a kind of free card about how this is managed, or a process. And I think we have to understand that the process needs to be interrogated. We need to look into how this works. And I'm worried about universities because museums have to go through this. They're very public in that space. They're not necessarily completely public, but they have a responsibility to that. Collections are murkier, as we know, you know, and it's, you know, the murkier, the more difficult it is, and the more that they're disconnected from one another. We've already seen one of the things that happens, which is that there can be a kind of fracturing. In other words, if some institution has a problem with a policy overview, then in fact what happens is that there's not that, they suddenly fall away from it and see it as not, that it's at odds with their curriculum development, with the focus of their collection, etc. Again, it's not theirs. Or it is in some instances if it's commissioned work and there's engagement, maybe. Maybe not completely, maybe it continues to be. How would Molly Hunt or Charlotte feel about us using it in really dodgy ways? There is an implicit, and I'm worried about implicit, agreement on use. Does that carry over to 20 and 40 years' time to bad actors? And yet we can't just assume everyone is a bad actor in this, maybe a little bit, but we have to understand what that shape looks like. And so, and we have to be able to interrogate it. And if we're disencouraging students from doing that, I'm deeply concerned. If we're disencouraging staff from doing that, I'm even more concerned. But community have a right to this, to accessing these collections. Indigenous community, if it's, or I'm using the term Indigenous because it's, you know, the blanket international term, but different communities, we know that one of the things that happens is certain people will become authorities, and we have to challenge that, and we have to make sure we're not that person, you know. So no matter how convenient it is or helpful it is or how much we think we're the right one, we have to kick against that as well, even in our own practice. I'm not just talking about not doing it, I just mean, you know, we have to think, who do we talk to, not who do we represent, who do we talk to and who do we engage with and who engages with us. And universities need to stop finding people that will agree with them. Anyway, I think that's it. Again, I know that it's just a collection, a kind of mashup of a lot of ideas and thoughts around what needs to happen with collections, but functionally, what we do need to do is to have more of these conversations. We have to think about the fact that there are distinctions for students often when they come into programs, for many of the community broadly, and for a lot of staff as well, including academic staff. There are distinctions that are made between art and object. I hate kind of making those distinctions because we know how fraught that is, but they do. And so we have to understand that, and we have to understand that people don't come to these collections with a broad knowledge. They often come with a query. And I think we need to stop offering up solutions from the archive and have people actually engaged with it, and just to go, maybe it's not here, maybe it's somewhere else, you know, and I can help you find that somewhere else. And ultimately, do we need to own things? They are going to be held, if we have existing collections, they will be held somewhere, but we must keep asking the question of why they're held where they are. Thanks. There you go.
So we have plenty of time for questions.
Oh, good.
So if people have any questions, microphone's
That
with me.
never happens to me.
So basically, I just wanted to say that really spoke to me. I've been working here at UC since about 2018. I work in Indigenous Studies, teaching in Indigenous Studies. I'm doing a PhD, and I look at archival collections through my work, but I look specifically at aviation heritage. And it's kind of funny because what you were talking about, it speaks to both my research, which I have a problem with my own research because I've been looking at archival collections that aren't, you know, made by or for Indigenous people. Yeah. They're collected, you know, but there's just so much complexity in the joy of collecting that some people have and the joy of accessing collections. But then there's so many problems for Indigenous people when we kind of engage and want to share these kind of silenced histories. Yeah. But we just have to navigate all of that. But then in my teaching as well, like teaching and this kind of pressure in a way to use this teaching collection at the university, I've always been incredibly uncomfortable by it. And I don't know, have you seen where our collection is?
No, I haven't. I've certainly had conversations.
Yeah, so it's quite an interesting space. It's a room, and it has the best view.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, you know, Harry Potter had a you know, his room.
Am I right in saying it's also around the uni?
Yes. So there's multiple things that I'll kind of speak to about that. So
Sarah and I will talk.
Yeah,
about
we're
Wait for it.
no, we won't. We'll talk about it now. But we're haters on this collection, not the collection, but on how it's actually been kept and displayed throughout the university. But so yeah, this collection, it's kind of in this little cupboard space. There's, you know, it's right next to the, you know, electrical.
If you can have a blacks out the back and then out the back room again.
Yeah, it's like kind of a classic 70s building, so that you know, you wouldn't know what's in there at all. And that, I'd worked here for many years. One day I was in my supervisor's, um, what is it, like office? And, yeah, that thing. But in my supervisor's office, and I saw this beautiful like featherwork that was sitting in the corner, and I said, "Oh, what's that?" And she said, "Oh, it's from the Indigenous teaching collection." So that was the first time I found out, well, one, that there was an Indigenous teaching collection, but but then slowly, as kind of Hakim and Wendy were mentioning, in the last couple of years, there's been this explosion of interest in this collection. I think led from, obviously both your interests in this collection, but I felt kind of, oh, I have to work with this collection, but personally, I just feel really uncomfortable about it, because it's the way it's stored and kept, and cared for in a way, because, well, we're used to care that's not brought out, it's not used, it's not connected back to its communities. It's so what my comment is, and I was just being tongue in cheek by that, how academics always have to have a comment. It's just, it's literally just, I just loved hearing that so much that I'm so hyped up by just hearing it, because you just need to hear this in these spaces, because you don't often, and the way I feel sometimes is, oh, I've got to be enthusiastic and, care about this collection because it's Indigenous, but it's not actually the materials in the collection that I'm kind of speaking to. It's the way it's been treated, and the way that it's kept. And then it's the way that we're kind of, okay, now we suddenly have to use it in our teaching, and it has to, but I feel so uncomfortable by the fact that it's not connected to its community, and that I'm from New South Wales, South Coast, and that's where my family is from. It's not my cultural objects. And so for me to go, oh, I have to use this in my teaching, it's just, and that's something that Del and I will talk about, is what we want to do. But yeah, I just wanted to just say, goddamn, like, I'm so excited. It probably is because I had too much coffee this morning, but I'm just going through a weird stage in my life.
Too much coffee.
Yeah, no, it's just, oh my God,
But
just
I
hearing
think
that.
it's the shape of these collections are often depends on when they were collected, obviously, depends on when they were gathered, rather than collected, but into that space. But they're often this response that is about the most reductive. So I don't expect to see any queer Indigenous stuff in any collection. It doesn't mean there won't be stuff. In fact, I know some of my work is in the Newcastle collection. So I know that there is work there. Absolutely 100% sure that they don't talk about it being queer. So this is the problem, is that they do this reductive stuff, but more than that, I mean, that's at least artwork. The whole idea of gathering material you might teach with becomes this kind of fantasy of the teaching, so of course it's going to be that. But some of this material is really important, and it's really important to communities. And so, and I know that one of our colleagues postdoc on the program, Rose, is going to be talking this afternoon a bit about that, about this issue of, how we engage and how we don't, Rose Barclay. But this is one of the problems, just generally, is that there isn't a great complexity to it. It isn't seen as an Indigenous collection, for instance, if it's a queer collection. When it comes to military, for instance, collections internationally, they often didn't point out that there was a lot of Indigenous engagement, particularly in Turtle Island. And so the military collections would be held by universities in some sort of military, and I'm sure the same thing happens across aviation, because again, it's complexity. And it's like, sorry, but is that Aboriginal? Is that an Indigenous thing? Of course it is. Everything is. Like critical Indigenous studies, that's the study of everything. Like all your disciplines are ours. That's how that works. And of course, it's a real problem for a more reductive, if there's a more reductive understanding in any archive. And they're the concerns that we have. Are museums doing a little bit, museums that aren't connected to universities doing a little bit more, or even ones that are? Sort of, yes, because there has been a push against this and there's been discussions around this. But, universities, of course, we'll hear later on about this, but universities across the country have different curating programs. And a lot of it is, of course, the fact that these are expensive collections, whether it's Indigenous or the broader collection, and it has to be managed in particular ways. I will point out that I come from Macquarie, if anyone knows the in-joke around the Vice Chancellor some years ago. But if you don't, you should look that up. But they may have thought something was theirs and taken it away. Anyway, so this whole notion of we need to keep was so much a part of the discussion that people tried to push through, and by people I mean Indigenous curators tried to push through in the 2000s, in the 2010s. And so the time that I was doing the research, the first part of the research, there was still so much resistance, and I'd come out of repatriation of human remains, and I'd come out of having a lot of court cases with many museums that I was then suddenly asking, what works? What's great about what you're doing in this representation? And then going, I remember you. And so there were some problems about that, but also there were some solutions in it, because the solutions were there as a discussion of what they're really trying to show and what they really can show. There came a point where it was just unseemly to be showing human bodies, not that there's still museums that do, but including Macquarie Museum. But, it is unseemly. It's only allowed when it's something else again, Egypt. It's only allowed when it's something that sits outside of, and this is the broadening of the public imaginary, and we've got to shift it. Like, that's what we have to do with students. That's our job with students. It's our job with research, is to kind of prod this and get people thinking about it, not feeling uncomfortable, but feeling discomfort in the processes and wanting to find solutions. That's anti-colonial. That's the work that everyone can do, anti-colonial work. Everyone can do that. And, the decolonial is, rearranging the deck chairs, and what we have to do is maybe throw some of those deck chairs out because they're not fit for purpose and make something new. Sorry, the analogy may have just been lost there, but, but the idea is that we must have some mechanism for being able to engage with material that is held and forget all of these, but all of this stuff that was written 20 years ago and even 15 years ago about, some communities don't even want material back off, like genuinely. If that becomes your beginning point, of course, you're searching for agreement. And part of it is that we should be searching for engagement.
My name's Jo Palmer. For those who don't know me, I'm from Macquarie. So
Thank you. From
Macquarie,
our
same place.
you weren't in any of the photos, but you were
Yeah,
there
I
in
know.
spirit.
I know. I was just wondering how I could Photoshop my head into one of them.
Yeah, I should have.
So of course, Sandy is one of our profs. Just a couple of observations, and I'm wondering if you can talk to this. So I'm also doing a PhD, and it's on the systemic annihilation of Māori women in the colonial Australian archives.
Yep.
But what I'm seeing a lot of lately, and I know that you are too, is this engagement on social media about queer representation in Indigenous communities, where you have our elders who are going, no, that's not queer. That's not right. And really good example of that is, for those of you who know the story of Pokara Kariana, very famous Māori song, was actually a lament from Tūtanakai, who was leaving his lover Tiki to go and marry a woman called Hinemoa.
Yep.
And that's where we get the word takutapui for LGBTIQ people. So what I'm really interested in is what happens when we're working in these collections and these archives and we're going, oh, that's queer representation. And then we have our own people going, no, it's not.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's a really important question, but also some of us are elders.
Yes.
And I think that's a really clear thing as well, is to say, having those discussions, I mean, it's about having discussions, not being belligerent with people. And to say, we use Visner's, you know, if we exist, our idea of Indigenous survivance. If I exist now as a trans non-binary person, then we existed in the past and will exist in the future. You know, there isn't some magical appearance. And I mean, people will talk about a kind of colonial incursion in that way. I call nonsense on it simply because, you know, the colonial project of gender in particular is one that's about containment and about reproduction. And reproductive rights that were not ours. And so having that conversation with people, but not doing it belligerently, just going, what do you think about this, is the strategy. If people are going to maintain belligerence, my question is always, how would you feel if one of your kids or your grandkids came up? Like, what are you going to say? Are you just going to not engage? And okay, that sounds a little bit like I'm shortcutting it, but obviously it's a broader process. And I think we've just got to write stories to bring them into truth. That's why they need to be in museums. That's why I was annoyed about First Americans Museum. I know I don't have a right to be annoyed about communities that aren't mine, but I hoped to see. I mean, it's in Oklahoma City, the biggest Indigenous museum in the world, and Lynn Riggs isn't in there. And Lynn Riggs' story isn't in there. And I know why, because they can't tell a bit of it. And I'm really sorry about that. But they might be able to soon. You know, so I don't want to like go, you're terrible. Look, they're not terrible, they just haven't yet. And I think we have to compel, because a kid goes in there and they see themselves erased. This is a problem. You know, this is genuinely a problem, and whatever it is, you know, but certainly when it comes to something as, you know, as in so much a part of who people are as their identity, it becomes incredibly important, but particularly when identity is asserted within those spaces. You know, when they're there to learn identity and they learn they don't belong. You know, what happens then? And so I don't have an answer except to say that I think it needs to be ongoing conversations.
Yeah, I don't think there's an answer. Sorry, just for what it's worth, I don't think there's an answer either. But I think it's
be belligerent, or they'll be not very knowledgeable about it, or just a little bit sometimes in between the two. And I actually just, it's not genuinely my experience. And obviously, you know, like they're faced with me, so so it could be. And yes, I mean, I know I get a lot of violent messages, but they're mostly from white people, to be fair.
Yeah. No, I'm seeing it across the board. That's why I think it's really good to have that discussion around it and acknowledgement.
Yeah, totally.
Moving a little bit further away from learning and teaching, but I was wondering if you could provide your perspective on the role of universities offering their infrastructure and services as digital keeping places.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's that last material, the stuff about what happens with the commissioned work when, you know, Brad and I drop dead. You know, like what happens at that point, sorry. You know, what happens at that point, because there was agreement, but also hidden agreement. And again, I mean, I realize this sounds a lot like when I was talking about problems with the, you know, the way that collections were kept historically as well. You know, how much is written about this, how much is known. And I think we've got a responsibility to do that. And I think part of that is digital collections. You know, I think it's, you know, this is again the reason why do you need object in that way? Like you've got access to actually digital forms as well, broadly outside of the university. So why are they held within the university? And sometimes it's because objects are held within the university and there's ownership. And we see this, you know, nationally and internationally a bit. I mean, the Smithsonian sold its rights to Disney. And, you know, it's for the reproduction and for a reason. They didn't want to be dealing with that, but it had implications. And so I think, again, you know, we might not have objects that are held in collection that are meaningful, but we're likely to draw on the broader public imaginary, often found on the internet, you know, often found in that space to be able to teach with. And that makes sense, depending on what you're doing. It also makes sense to record and engage with community. I mean, engage with community and record it. But again, does somebody get to come along and just use that recording in their teaching when they're not connected? And we know that this is a question that it comes up again and again, even the union has dealt with it. And so, this is a real concern on the development of curriculum, but it's definitely a concern on the management of any kind of, when I use the term object, I think it includes digital collections. It's just that they're still not terribly well understood by all of those people who don't understand collections, and sometimes by some of the people who do, because again, there's a disconnect, of course, across universities. Some universities have, curators of whole collections who are really new and don't understand the university. We've had this time and again, don't understand the university system and maybe have never managed a whole of collection before. And so there's a whole lot of issues that are not to do with metadata that are actually, for instance, which, is another aspect of it, that are to do with the kind of digitally held collection and the broader collection and the meshing of the two. And so we know that what often happens is that the library ends up having the responsibility for books and things that look like, but also not in other instances, particularly when it looks like art.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. So I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about the politics of whimsy.
Of
Whimsy. Because it sort of strikes me that it's a really kind of useful anti-colonial tool to challenge like the sanitization of the archive without that being prohibited. Like, if you do other kinds of initiatives, obviously they're going to say, no, you can't be that confrontational, but whimsy gets around that in a way. So,
totally. Look, and I think there's some interesting non-Indigenous writers who've written around whimsy. I think Lisa Tamnetti has written around it, Jeff Berglund has. There's a lot of Indigenous writers who write about things that are like, maybe I'm using that term and you are too, but, there is a kind of complexity around it. Sandra Phillips and myself and Luke Pearson for Indigenous X wrote a piece a few years ago in the Indigenous X book, it's freely available online, that talks about the power of Indigenous X going out and making fun of really, really dodgy racist stuff, and then some concerns about it coming home to roost, because this is one of the concerns, is that there was a lot of fight back with that as well. But also, how can you not make jokes about, this ridiculous situation where we pay rent on our own land? I mean, how do you not make a joke about that? How does it not become whimsy? And that's what we're seeing happening with some of this art. And I think that there is the potential for a complex discussion that can be had around the making of work, in particular, artwork in particular, because Indigenous artists, unlike a lot of other artists, not all, but many, talk about their work a lot. And so there is a lot of discussion around this. That isn't necessarily about the artists, but about other people asking them. And so there's a lot more material that's available to be able to engage with that. But whimsy generally is not just about this kind of sarcastic response to the colony. It's also about the idea of humor and I guess the unexpected. And it's unexpected because the expected is serious collections that were all colonial. Even if sometimes they were done by us, they were still this idea of what belongs in a collection. Maybe it's this, maybe it's this, maybe it's something serious. Oh yes, we want to be taken seriously, this. And so looking for that work and seeing that work, we're just seeing far more complexity around it now. And I've certainly seen a lot, and it's something that really appeals. And so for that reason, can you think of any examples, Hen?
Well, I mean, the thing that immediately comes to mind is not so much a museum, but particularly the kind of whimsy that comes up in something like Reservation Dogs.
Oh, of course,
yeah. There's just the kind of more general commentary.
Reservation Dogs, Hen saying, look, this is, one of the reasons that we're doing representation we've got a major survey that we did on queer TV And we were specifically looking at Indigenous out from. And Indigenous out from is really important. You know, one of the things that we've written about with it is, so we got 1,500 people responding, and bloody hell, you wouldn't believe it, but like almost everybody wrote several hundred words. So there's a massive amount of material on what people think about queer representation on television, right? And we wanted to look at complexity of representation in particular, and we wanted to understand Indigenous and racially diverse, complex representation in general. But obviously we start off from Indigenous centred, and we'd been led by a discussion point that, if you've ever heard me speak in the last few years, you've probably heard me say this before, but you know, we had someone I was giving a keynote, and I had someone say to me when I asked this question, have you ever seen yourself represented on TV? I mean, all of you, have you ever seen yourself represented on TV? Think about who you are, think about that representation. For a lot of queer people, but for a lot of queer Black people, they've never seen themselves, but other people too have never seen themselves, have never seen someone who's quite like them. And what does it mean to not see representation? We're a little bit shocked to hear that a lot of people did not want representation because they had to deal with the fallout of bad representation as well. But one of the things that popped up was, you know, we had, as I'd asked that question, somebody had responded. I had COVID at the time, so I was doing the keynote remotely, and I couldn't hear that it was actually our colleague that was saying it, but who said, I saw someone exactly like me. I'd never seen anything like it before. This is a Torres Strait Islander person, young person, in their 20s. Never seen it before. It was remarkable that suddenly I felt seen. You know, I saw someone who's queer. I saw someone who's, you know, who's just like me. And I said, that's amazing. Thinking, Torres Strait Islander queer rep, was that then? Young person. It was in A League of Their Own. Which is set in the 1940s, and it is a Black American person who's queer. Because that's the thing, we actually know how to see representation. We know how to make that journey to representation. The more that you don't see yourself represented, arguably, and there's quite a lot of research on this, the more that you want to. And I think this is the reason that we're looking at the public imaginary and why collections matter within this and why museums matter within this is these are all the engagements in the spaces. TV, weirdly, it turns out more people are watching it than ever, which surprised me. But, you know, particularly the long form of the constructed story, you know, we were interested in the idea that you would see something and it would go maybe for a few years and see the development of character. And so this whole idea of representation of something that makes meaning for the audience, for the visitor, for the person engaging who's going to develop curriculum is really, really important when it comes to collections. And we're constantly trying to work out what the meaning is and whether it's fit for purpose. And I think we have to keep engaging that. And so I think whimsy is a part of that, because whimsy also often makes you laugh. And we know that from an audience perspective, laughter is engagement, and it actually gets you a little invested. So there's some interesting things about that too, but it also has to be connected in some way. You know, it has to be meaningful, or it has to be made to be connected. And that's no mean feat. So,
the other example would be Troy Anthony.
What's that? Oh, Troy Anthony Ballas's work, of course. I mean, there's lots of examples as artists doing work that engages whimsy. And in fact, Han just led a paper that we've written on that. So.
But thank you, Sandy, again for the
you're really
wonderful
welcome.
thought.